Okay, we're live. Great. Welcome everyone to the volume 6 we're up to as we work through trying to create the world's best yacht risk list. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to look at maritime risk management standards. As we've explained in other videos, I come from a medical device background. That was the standard we started for. They're all very similar in the way they work, but I think it's useful to go out and look at how the maritime industry does risk management. And what we have on the screen here, this is a European database. This is something from the EU. Looking for my glasses, apologies. And it's a reporting database on maritime incidents. And it's kind of interesting. There's a couple of things here we'll just go through quickly. So we've got the time period here from 2011 to 2026, and that's when it started. This was enacted by some sort of regulation in the EU, and again, apologies, I haven't read the regulation, but looking at it, it looks like some sort of obligatory reporting system for any incidences on commercial yachting, commercial boats, maritime, commercial maritime. So we've got the the period here. We have here the place on board, and what that means is where on board was it happening. So unfortunately, it looks like if you're working in the engine room, engine department, that's where the majority of accidents are at the top, and then the deck, and then somewhere else in the ship, over the side, all the way down to ship quarter, ship bulbous, etc. And I'm guessing this is probably a combination. The incidence, the frequency is probably a combination of the hazards in that area of work and possibly the frequency of being at that location. So the ship bulbous, I assume, is well, it's a good question. Let's not assume anything. I am thinking about the bulbous bow. That's what I'm thinking. Look, I'll assume it is for now. We can check that out. We've actually got some terms we'll go through. You're probably not on that so often. So, this does not necessarily say what's more dangerous, because you want to look at some sort of base level usage, or, where you are. Then we got the sea area of occurrence, internal waters, territorial, high seas, inland water. So it looks like internal waters are where a lot of these incidents occur. Maybe at some point we can take a look at that, especially in Europe. There's a lot of inland waterways, the big rivers that people sail on, a lot of traffic. So it'd be very interesting to see what's actually driving that incidents. Territorial sea, which I assume is sea owned by the nation. So before the international line, high sea, and we've got inland waters. So internal waters and inland waters. Again, not 100% sure the difference of those two, but again, we'll look into that. Ship's operation, normal in service, in passage, normal service, maneuvering, etc. So what was the ship doing at the time? And here we've got the timeline of events, the account of events over time. So it looks like we're running somewhere between 200 to 400 events per month, which is, again, it sounds like a lot, but we don't know how many ships are out there and how many crew are out there. It'll be very interesting to look at that as a percentage. And there's a whole bunch of different filters. So in our previous streams, we discussed, where do you go to look for sources of identifying hazards? So here is a great source to go look at these publicly available registers of incidences and see if any are, any relate to our private boating. And then if we go here, this is the information page. I really won't go into it too much, but just explains, what it is. European Marine Casualty Information Platform. We have some regulations here. Here you can find the link to the dashboard. I'm just going to pop that into the chat. EU casualty reporting dashboard link. So if anybody wants to look at that, there it is, and get the link to the dashboard. And one of the very interesting things here is that we've got these glossary of terms. Now, given this is a reporting database, all the fields are going to be more or less pick lists, I assume. So there's going to be certain fields, the way they cut the data so they can do comparisons, get those trend reports, get those graphs, bar charts, and those sort of things. So here we've got a very interesting document on the glossary, the meaning, all the terms of the reporting. And again, it's a pretty big document, 186 pages. It's worth a scroll through if you're into it. And what is actually interesting for us is, well, there's a lot interesting. We'll ignore generic factual information. So ship particulars, recreational craft particulars, so that's a bit of an insight. Looks like it does cover recreational craft. Voyage particulars, we'll come to that in a second because I've done an update to the risk list. Ship casualty data and consequences. So if you remember in our spreadsheet, we have a hazard categorization, the severity of harm here. We go from negligible to minor, and we look at the human, the crew damage, human damage, vessel damage, our vessel damage, and third-party property. Now, as you can imagine, given risk management's a pretty standard approach, here they don't call it harm, they call it consequences. So same idea, but different naming. And they've got loss, damage to the ship. We have that. Marine pollution, which I actually don't have, and I think that would probably be a really good addition to the risk list. So I'm just going to add in, I'll just add it in here. I'm just going to call it environment because they split pollution from water pollution and air pollution. So marine pollution, consequences on people, third-party consequences, and air pollution. So I think now we've got all of that. We've got loss, damage to our ship. We have the pollution. We have not split between marine and air. We just have environment. That's fine. Consequences on people and third-party consequences. So our risk list is starting to shape up to match at least this glossary of terms, the way the EU does it. And then we have, ignore that for the moment. Yeah, so the casualty analysis. So here, they actually call casualty, if I remember correctly. I thought we had okay. Again, to be confirmed, but they actually seem to call the harm, the damage to boats, the harm to boats, a casualty, and the damage to people is actually something different. So casualty events, accidental events, and then they break it down into environmental effect, equipment failure, hazardous material, human erroneous action, other agent or vessel unknown. Now here, that says casualty. It sounds like causality, but let's see, either my English or given I haven't really dived so deep into this, it's probably my understanding, contributing factors, etc., etc. So yeah, as we said, you can have a look at this, and at some point we'll actually start using this. But I want to go to page 89 because one of the outstanding things we have on our risk list is to start to populate the meaning of each of these category levels. So for example, on negligible, on human, we've got, say, mental stress and maybe minor pain could be one. So that could be you bump yourself, but there's no real bruising. There's no cuts, nothing like that. So it could be just a minor temporary pain. And then the minor could be a minor cut, abrasion, bruising. I need to come up with a stress, psychological impact. And then, as we discussed, catastrophic could be death, permanent injury, severe trauma, for example. An event that gives you post-traumatic stress, would potentially be a very catastrophic injury. So at least we've got an estimate here, but what we're looking for is for categories here for our vessels, our third property, our environment. Now, why that's important is because on our risk list, these categories are used to normalize our analysis, because we can look here and then we can filter, we can group by common categories across a whole bunch of hazardous situations. But when we're coming up with that determination of the severity, we want to have a pretty good rule of thumb, or better than a rule of thumb, to be able to determine what category it fits in. And in this case, by being able to describe the impact on, the impact on the human, the vessel, third party, whatever, we should be able to narrow it down. And it's always one of these areas where it's up to a little bit of debate, but it helps a hell of a lot. And that becomes really important in our risk assessment to work out if we're in the acceptable, tolerable, or unacceptable range. So when I was looking through this today, we've got here the consequences section. So loss, damage to ship. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, it's a long day. So here we've got, I'll just zoom in a bit. That looks like it might be a bit too small. Hopefully people can read it. Maybe we just go up a bit more. So here we've got loss of ship, constructive loss, damage, total loss, not applicable. Now, constructive loss, these are potentially all terms. When damaged property is not completely destroyed, but fixing costs more than items insured value or policy limit. Now, you may not believe that's what I thought it was, but that's what I thought it was. Some sort of insurance term, so it's just not worth fixing. So that's more financial loss. Damage can be repaired, then total loss. So here again, this is not mapped to any common sort of harm severities, but it's useful to have in there. So I've got, for example, in our category, we've got a total insurance write-off here, and we could also call that a constructive loss. And also, if you were doing this in a professional environment, and maybe we'll do it at some point, or at least I'll put up some web pages, we'll write a risk plan for our risk list with all of these terms and explain to people how it's going to work. But yeah, once we get this group going, I see we've got one viewer. Thank you very much for joining. It's great to have you here. Feel free to say hi and contribute. So once we get this group going, hopefully tens or potentially hundreds of people. It's not going to be the biggest stream in the world by any chance, but we need, if we get a group of very good, dedicated people, we can really build something amazing here. Right. So then we've got cost, loss, repair, cargo damage, probably on a private boat. Cargo could be, personal effects. So that's possibly days immobilized. Yeah, it could be interesting. You buy a boat to use it. So if it's, got to get pulled out and sit in the yard, who knows how long, because, the good yards are backed up usually. And then it depends on where you're pulled out of the water. So one of the issues I've had with my boat, I bought it in a fishing village on the west coast of Scotland. There is a boatyard there, probably quite a good boatyard, but they're servicing fishing boats and they're always full. So it took me 3 or 4 months to actually get in there and do the inspections I needed before I was confident to actually move it. So one little event, depending where you get pulled out, could actually lay your boat up for quite a while, right? Potentially. Description of the damage, fine. Ship rendered unfit to proceed, so can't be navigated, loss, etc. So again, you can probably tell I don't have a good understanding how the database works yet. I'll dive into it, but these are interesting consequences that we can use when we're updating the meaning of the categories in our risk list here to the vessel. Right, so we're just doing a bit of a scouting trip here today. Now, consequences on marine pollution, bunker waste. Okay, asphalt, distillates, gas oil, gasoline, gasoline blending stocks, jet fuel, naphtha, oils. So this, I assume, are the things, the waste which is leaked into the ocean. Q recovered, Q spilled, dangerous material, Q I assume is quantity. So it's probably an attempt to quantify the volume of waste that was first spilt and then recovered. Again, remember these are database fields, UN number, hazards, etc., etc. Right. Now, so this consequence on people. So this is one that we could potentially take some lessons from for our risk list categorization. Lives lost, we already have that. Crew casualty, lives lost, crew emergency. Okay. Lives lost passenger, lives lost other. People injured crew, people injured others, accident, casualty stage. And here we've got definition, was it a casualty or an accident? Emergency, abandoned ship, life saving use, other related operations, damage, danger control, firefighting, towing, pushing, rescue, other. So these are the categories of the type of emergency. Again, interesting, not quite sure how we build that into the list. I'm guessing these would probably be included in the hazardous situation potentially. So etc. etc. So look, as you can tell, not so familiar with this list, but it's there. Then on some other ones I found, we've got the American Bureau of Shipping, the risk assessment applications for marine and offshore industry. So if you ever watched the live stream where we looked at the ISO 14971 risk management procedure, now that's the procedure for medical devices, which we said was, designed for a different industry, but had a good risk management process. This is the American Bureau of Shipping for risk management process for maritime. Now, when you look at it, it's actually relatively similar, kind of similar, kind of different to what we've built. So the interesting here is a couple of things. If we go, we'll skip down here. Right, so we haven't really, we've driven a little bit home the benefits of doing risk management, because ultimately we want to save lives and we want to save boats. And we want to protect the downside because we buy boats because we want to go on the water and have a good time. We want to do these amazing trips we want to do, right? We want to use it. We want to get there safely. We enjoy a bit of a challenge, but we never want that challenge to tip over on the other side into disaster. So the benefits here, hazard identification and protection, which is what we're doing with the risk list. The risk list is really a big list of hazardous scenarios and attempts to put in risk controls to mitigate them. And just a quick point here, this is strategic work, right? This is not operational. We will discuss equipment, but it's not really the main focus to say which equipment, how to use it, how to assess it. We'll touch onto that a little bit, but it's really to identify the hazardous scenarios we can all get into. How do you mitigate? And part of that mitigation will be the equipment you need on board. And again, if we proceed, potentially we can get into equipment, but it's really this sort of strategic planning assessment of risk. Right, so operational improvement. Okay, this is more commercial maritime, but we can look at it in terms of our operational management of our boats. Definitely, we can probably all improve it somehow. Efficient use of resources. Okay, fair enough. Rules and regulation development and compliance. Probably not overly applicable to this group. However, there's often groups asking for input on legislation or ideas or whatever. So again, let's see how we go. Maybe this group will be able to contribute somehow. Okay. So you can go read that. Limitations, and this is really good too. So completeness, model uncertainty. So risk management is almost a never-ending task because a lot of it's about trying to identify all the scenarios, all the things that could go wrong. So, it's up to date during a point in time. And then it really has to be reviewed over and over again and take learning, see what else is happening, and update it. And then we get changes in technology. So, some boats are going fully electric with lithium batteries, and that's going to introduce a whole bunch of different hazards and harms that don't exist on, diesel powered boats, for example. So, reproducibility, right? So maybe that means you come up with that hazard scenario, mitigations, is it a once in a lifetime? Does it reproduce? Yeah, okay. Usability, how usable is it? Relevance of experience. Yeah, this is a good one. Various risk assessment techniques rely significantly on the expertise of the participants, which is a really good point. On this stream, at some point, we'd like to get experts on board and interview them. We dive deep into certain aspects of risk. So there's a very innovative Swiss company, for example, and they build this smart connected anchor connector, I guess you call it, which goes in your chain. There's a camera, it measures the angle of your anchor, all this sort of stuff. So you can be confident in anchoring. So I'm guessing when we do get onto the whole anchoring theme, then we will be able to potentially talk to them and get them to tell us what are the risks associated with anchoring, and how then can you mitigate that. Subjectivity, data uncertainty. And this is a big one we really keep coming into here. We hear stories, we hear different scenarios, but there's always a question, do we know how often it is? Is it really significant? Is it a one-off? And especially around the assessment of the risk, there's a lot of subjectivity. So what I think the risk profile is, it may be very different to what you think the risk profile is. And that's probably one of the most difficult things to do. On the consequence side, the harm side, I think there's more agreement there usually. There's more on the probability side where people tend to argue a lot more. Right. Definitions. So consequence here is the outcome of an event occurrence in terms of people, property affected. We were calling that harm. I prefer harm, but you let me know, we can change it. I will actually throw it in here in our risk list. Unmitigated harm, consequence. No reason why we can't do both. Controls, so we have risk controls. They're talking about controls taken to prevent hazards, so we're pretty much the same. Now this was good. Establishing the context is defining the external and internal parameters to be considered when managing risk and setting the scope and criteria for risk management policy. So what I've actually done, I've added a column here for context, and we can use that for internal and external context. So that could be the location, you're at sea, inland, navigating in the marina. It could be the weather, the sea state, are you on a coastline? Is there an onshore breeze, offshore breeze? All these different things, which obviously give you different types of potential harm outcomes depending on the context you're operating in. So he's a new crew, experienced crew, all these sort of things. So I think that's a very good addition. And then from that, you can do the hazardous situations and the steps you go through to actually deliver that leads to the harm. So we've taken that on board. Evaluation metrics are qualitative and or quantitative parameters selected to characterize or evaluate a proposed design in terms of its level of safety, to judge the adequacy of the design. Valuation metrics could directly measure risk, fatalities per year, but can also be any one component that affects risks. reliability of a system, frequency of loss of propulsion events. So I need to dive into this. This sounds like contributing factors or even potentially outcome events, things you would manage in a risk system. But again, I'm not 100% sure how that works in this form. In this one, event is an occurrence that has an associated outcome. There are typically a number of potential outcomes from any one initial event, which may range in severity. So that's what we're calling our hazardous situation. Frequency is an occurrence of event over time, typically expressed as events per year. Hazards or threats are conditions that exist which may potentially lead to an undesirable event. So again, that's the same as we've defined. A hazard is a potential harm. Just because a hazard exists does not mean that it will lead to a harm. Probability is a measure of the chance of occurrence expressed as a number between 0 and 1, where 0 is impossibility and 1 is absolute certainty. So again, that is our probability assessment. And risk identification, the process of finding, recognizing, describing risks. And again, we've started doing that. We've got about half a dozen risks. Risk matrix is a tool for ranking and displaying risk by defining ranges for consequence and likelihood. And again, we've done that here. And what I can do now is actually put a heading on it, because I haven't done that yet. Risk matrix. There we go. And then we have abbreviations. We're going to skip through these. Oh, excuse me. Sorry again. So basics of risk assessment: what can go wrong, how likely it is, what are the impacts. So that's exactly what we have in our risk matrix. The hazardous situation is what can go wrong, the outcomes, and the probability of occurrence. So we're there. And here, this is one of those graphs which meant to communicate something. It probably does. How likely is it, what go wrong, risk understanding, and foundation for risk assessment. Okay, so this is actually very useful. So how do we do our risk assessment? Historical experience. We look at statistics, we look at events, we look at reports, these sort of things, and some of that we've started doing here. We found another source with the European database. Analytical methods, the way you do your analysis, knowledge and judgment. So this is based on the experience of individuals involved. And then we have risk assessment techniques. So here it's pretty much the same. This is the same process. I'm not going to go into it, but this is good. So these are a whole bunch of different types where different types of risk assessment techniques that can be used to actually identify risks. So for us, I think there's a whole bunch of things to do. Some of these can get pretty detailed, and again, it depends on what you're analyzing. So I can imagine if you've got like a gas tanker, there's a hell of a lot of risk management there to look at a whole series of events that could go wrong. But for us, we will probably start with just hazard identification technique as really the starting point. And we'll dive into some of these as we go along. So yeah, a whole bunch of different assessment techniques. So again, this is a good one to have. It's worth reading through at some point. And then finally, we've got the IMO, the revised guidelines for formal safety assessment. Right. So this one here is very similar: terminology, methodology, problem definition, identification of hazards, risk analysis, risk control, cost benefit assessment. So you're probably starting to recognize that process by now. And Yeah, examples of hazards. That's what I want to look at too, because one of the areas we need to start developing out on the risk list is our hazard categories. So we've only got a few, which I've just written, but again, using a reliable source like this could be interesting. So I think we might do that now. Let's go to Appendix 2 and let's just see, whoops, let's see what they have as their hazards. Shipboard hazards to personnel, asbestos inhalation. Okay, hopefully we've all removed our asbestos. Burns from caustic liquids and acids. Yes, possible on a private boat. Electric shock, electrocution, definitely. Falling overboard, definitely. Pilot ladder, pilot hoist operation. Probably not for us, although if you are crossing between boats at sea, which people do on occasion, potentially that's similar, let's say. Hazardous substance on board a ship, accommodation area, combustible furnishings. Yeah, I might have a bit of that problem at the moment, unfortunately. Cleaning materials, oil, fat in galley equipment. I think they're all relevant. Deck areas, cargo. So here, maybe not cargo for us, but if we have things tied down like dinghies or spare anchors or different things, basically anything that can move on deck. That's something we have to consider. Paint, oil, greases, etc. in deck stores, potentially for us. Machinery spaces, cabling, yes. Fuel and diesel for engines, boilers, incinerators, yes. Fuel, lubricating, hydraulic oil in bilges, sails, yes. Refrigerants, maybe less so for us because here we're talking commercial shipping and these will be have these large refrigerated carriers. Thermal heating fluid systems on a boat. What have we got? We'll have a boiler potentially, so that's a potential source of harm, definitely, um, especially if it's turned up high. And then we are going to have potentially boiler systems to heat the boat. I will say these are potential hazards. I'm not sure any of these are going to cause major burns, but it's definitely worth looking at. Hot water is a potential hazard. Potential source of ignition. Now, this is really important because one of our first ones we did was fire. Fire needs an ignition source, fuel, and oxygen to get going. So here they've identified potential sources of ignition, which is really powerful. Electric arc, friction, hot surface, incendiary spark, naked flame, and radio waves. These ships have very high-powered electronics. On our boats, we do have a category there for electromagnetic radiation, but from what I can tell, these should be relatively safe. Unlike if you're on a naval boat, for example, you stand on the roof next to some of that equipment, you'll get cooked, which we don't have on our boats. Accommodation areas, electronic navigation equipment, we have those. Laundry facilities, irons, washing machines, tumble dryers. Some boats might have some of those things, so it's probably worth looking at some point. Deck areas, deck lighting, definitely. Funnel exhaust emissions, definitely. Hot work sparking. So I guess this is things like welding or cutting, which they're doing underway. Air compressor units. Yes, I have an air compressor on board, for example. Generator, engine, exhaust, manifold. Yeah, I don't know why it's just generator, engine, all exhaust manifolds can get hot. And then hazards external to the ship, storms, lightning, uncharted, submerged objects, other ships. So that is their, oh, these are examples of hazards. Okay. So I think there's some of these stuff I can take across to the spreadsheet, which I'll probably do in the next day. But there's things here like fall hazards, falling from height, trip hazards. There's this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah, so more ways of analyzing risk, and we've covered some of this. Yeah, some of this stuff is great. It's fun to do, but it does take time. So we're going to hold off on doing this stuff for now. But once we really start get moving and we've got a substantial list, might actually start re-reviewing some of them from the sort of, I wouldn't call it simplistic, let's call it first pass methodologies we have now, which is great. Do a first pass, get a lay of the land, and then you go deeper into certain high risk hazardous scenarios just to make sure that you attack it from every angle and make sure it's safe. And the curious thing is that sometimes we think a risk control is 100% safety, 100% control, but often risk controls introduce their own risk. So you do get this knock-on effect. So again, if you love this stuff like I do, there should be some pretty fun times ahead. Measures, terminology of risks. Yeah, okay, this is all good stuff too, etc. So yeah, this is all industrial stuff. So if you're doing manufacturing plants, products, ships, you're going to have some pretty cool statistics to look at. Now, attributes of risk control measures. This is very good for us too, because we haven't actually introduced this yet. So risk control measures, category A, preventive risk control, mitigating risk control. So one will reduce the probability of the event, and the mitigating risk control reduces the severity of the outcome of the event. And that's a really important distinction, because we've already identified that today when we do the unmitigated severity, unmitigated probability, we come up with an unmitigated risk assessment from our matrix. Then we do risk controls and we reassess the severity and the probability. So here, for example, this is a petrol canister near to a heat source. We reduce the severity by actually making sure that petrol was in an explosion-proof canister. So that is actually something which will reduce the severity of the outcome. Whereas here we also move from likely to very low, because in this slightly silly example, but these things can happen, we move the petrol canister away from the heat source. So the ignition source could not get close to the petrol canister. So in this case, we've actually reduced severity and probability. And in this guidance here, these are category A attributes. And we've got category B attributes. Engineering risk controls involving safety features either built in or added on. I would probably put the explosion-proof petrol canister as an engineering risk control, potentially. Involves safety features either built in or added on within a design. Such safety features are safety critical when the absence of the safety feature would result in an unacceptable level of risk. Inherent risk control is where at the highest conceptual level in the design process, choices are made that restrict the level of potential risk. Now, for most of us, our boats are as they are, and the design is what the design is. And we're left to literally shuffle things around the deck or internally. So maybe there are some design risk controls we could do. So we looked at a sinking of a 6-meter motor cruiser, which was built a long time ago. They did not have internal buoyancy compartments, but there's no reason on a small fiberglass boat you can't put in watertight compartments, fiberglass them in, or, and this is that will be a design control. But another risk control could be flotation bags, for example. So, you know, if we're making changes to the boat, especially big structural changes, we have this opportunity to do this. So, for example, on my boat, unfortunately, the last owner cut off all the hatches because they wanted big flat decks, and now I've got, you know, flush hatches which kind of don't open, which are not great, and I actually need to reinstall them. So I'll work with the engineer, get the design. Luckily, I've got the plans, and unfortunately, I just have to reinstall the old hatches. Okay. Procedural risk control, where operators are relied upon to control the risk by behaving in accordance with defined procedures. So here, operators are crew, people operating machinery. And I think, you know, procedural risk controls on our boats is really important. Most boaties will have at least one checklist on their boat. And you've heard me say this over and over again. Checklists are great because our memories are fallible. Our memories are a false friend. And our experience counts for nothing if we don't forget. So the best combination is an experienced person on the boat with a checklist, working through it and checking off they did it. And when they execute it, using their experience to make sure they're doing the right thing and assessing the risk. So we will touch on that somewhat in my app, Yacht Prep. I do have checklists which people can use. So here we go, checklists. So for example, one of the checklists is a nighttime navigation light pre-departure checklist, which is a really simple one. But basically, while you're in the marina, turn on all your lights, your navigation light, your anchor light, your spotlights, walk around the boat, make sure they're working, and then either turn them off or just leave the navigation lights on when you go out. And the checklist there is important for one reason: to make sure you turn them all on, right? That's one. Make sure you've checked them all. That's two. And then before you depart, make sure you only have on the lights that you want. So if you want to check the anchor light while you're in port, that's fine, but make sure you turn it off before you depart. And it's some of those simple things that can happen where you just forget to turn it off for some reason. But you've got a checklist which says turn anchor light on, inspect anchor light, turn it off. It sounds very pedantic, but if you follow it, if you do it, especially if you've got an app on your phone like my product, then you just don't forget, right? It becomes operationalized. And this is why, unfortunately, even experienced people get into trouble just because they forget. No blame, no whatever, we're just human. So one of the biggest risk controls is us. So sorry about the little lecture there, but it's nice to see some of this thinking put into the standards. Category C attributes: diverse risk control is where the control is distributed in different ways across aspects of the system, whereas concentrated risk control is where risk control is similar across aspects of the system. Don't have an example for you now, but we'll find one. Okay, redundant risk control. There's a really great, fantastic example of this. One of the big life raft manufacturers, I won't say which, you can find it at some point, they had a problem with one of their service stations in Portugal, I think. So a fishing boat had their life raft serviced. It was in the service period, so it was a valid certificate. The boat sank and the life raft didn't open. And the reason the life raft didn't open, because the service station did not change the gas cylinder. So it was defective. So the owner, the operator of the fishing boat was doing exactly the right thing, had their certificates, but the service provider did the wrong thing. And in a safety critical situation, that life raft didn't open. However, the redundant risk control was they had two life rafts on board. And guess what? The second life raft opened and the crew, as I understand it, were rescued. So these are the really things we need to think about as well in our risk control. So how many of us carry two life rafts on board? Now I just replace, again, my boat's a bit of a mess. I've had it for a year and a half. It's a ex-pilot boat, needs a lot of work on it, but the life raft was 20 years old, so I had to replace it, obviously. But that's £1,500, I think it was. But it's worthwhile to have for another £1,500. You want that on board. And we did a worked example recently of this, motor cruiser getting swamped and sinking, 4 people in the water, no life jackets on board. And they were 1.6 miles from the coast. There was a lifeboat station literally 1.6 miles away, but nobody knew they were there. And we just don't want to be in these silly situations where we can come up with really great risk control procedures, so that if something does go wrong, we get rescued. And again, sorry for the preaching. This is why I'm building this list with people, because I don't know, we just don't, we want people to have a good time on the water. We want them to be safe. Right. So redundant risk control, there we go. Extra something. One more example of redundant risk control, and then we'll move on. So for example, check your flares. Are all your flares from the same lot, have the same lot number with the same expiry date? If so, if you really want to do this redundant risk control, make sure you have other flares of the same type, for example, orange smoke flare or rocket flare, whatever, with a different lot number. Because just as I've identified with the life raft example, we don't know, especially with these single-use items like life rafts and flares, we get one shot at it. We don't know if they're going to work or not until we need them. So they're really good examples of a characteristic of an item where having redundancy in place. And flares, okay, they're cheap. If one doesn't work and you got a few on board, you should have, find one that works, I hope. But the life raft one, that's a fairly inexpensive risk control. But the life jacket one, if you've got a boat, I guess you're used to spending money. So £1,000 for a lot of boat owners is, what is it? Boat stands for bring another $1,000. Right. Passive risk control, where no action is required to deliver the risk control measure, whereas active risk control is where the risk control is provided by the action of safety equipment or operators. So maybe a passive risk control could be flotation bags on that small cruiser, for example. Whereas an active risk control provided by the action of safety equipment. So for example, your hydrostatic release on your life jacket, that's a risk control which happens due to the equipment, right? Or launching a life raft is action that's taken by the operator. Independent risk control is where the risk control measure has no influence on other elements. I'm not coming up with a good example for that at the moment. Dependent risk control is where one risk control measure can influence another element of the risk contribution tree. So I'm not sure this is 100% correct, but let's say the life raft doesn't inflate or the hydrostatic doesn't go off and it sinks with the boat. Then the follow-on safety impact of that is the crew cannot get out of the water into a life raft with water, food, flares. So there's a dependency downstream. Not 100% sure that's what they mean, but that's some of the things we need to think about. Involve human factors where human action is required to control the risk, but where the failure of the human action will not in itself cause an accident or allow an accident sequence to progress. Interesting. I have to think about that one. There is human factors in design of products, ergonomics, and safety features built in. It sounds similar, but again, I'll do some more research on this. Critical human factors where human action is vital to control the risk, either where failure of the human action will directly cause an accident or allow an accident sequence to progress. Where a critical human factor attribute is assigned, the human action should be clearly defined in the risk control measure. So again, here we're talking about things like training, skill, experience, procedures, assessment, retraining, these sort of things. So one example here I can think about is a sea survival suit. They're designed, you're meant to be able to get them on in less than 2 minutes, but they say that a good time is 60 seconds. So here's a question. If you're going down in cold water, you've got to get your sea survival suit on. How many of your crew can put that on in 60 seconds? Right? Interesting question. I've got sea survival suits on board my boat now. Again, I don't know when they're from. They're from the 80s or 90s probably, but I haven't tried it yet, but that's one thing I have to do. And the other one here, interestingly, could be, for example, man overboard. So I've got man overboard davits on my boat. I've got like about a 2-3 feet freeboard. It's a reasonably big freeboard. So I need to drop a ladder. I need to use a winch, Jacob's ladder, a whole bunch of different techniques to get people back on board the boat. So that safety equipment I've got on board the boat, the winch, the ladder, the Jacob's ladder, these sort of things are meaningless if the crew, me, don't know how to use it. So I guess we could call that a critical human factor. Auditable or non-auditable reflects whether risk control measure can be audited or not. Yeah, interesting. I'm just going to drop that one for the moment. quantitative or qualitative reflects whether the risk control measure has been based on a quantitative or qualitative assessment of risk. And again, I think we've discussed this over and over again. In a manufacturing environment, you're producing millions of widgets. You can work out with a pretty reasonable statistical significance what your defect rate is. Especially, I would say, in leisure boating, private boating, there's probably not really great statistical databases to give you a reasonable probability of risk of something occurring. So again, this is where we get a lot of things into subjective risk assessments, and a lot of it has to be based on common sense. Or if we get into some of these more advanced techniques, there are ways you can assign probability to paths. And while it's not going to be 100% accurate, you can get more probable and less probable. So order of magnitude. Established or novel reflects where the risk control measure is an extension to existing marine technology or operations, whereas novel is where the measure is new. So I would say, for example, all these new AI integrated with your radar, I would say that's novel at the moment. It's still pretty new in the last 1 to 2 years. Soon, I think that will very much come to established. So these are the kind of technologies that are coming in place. And I think, one thing we still struggle with private boating is, it's best practice. Maybe I'm getting old. The best practice is to always have paper charts on your boat, and make sure it's always up to date. So if you had on the boat a few years, take it to your chart place and get them to update it, because I think more and more electronic navigation is very reliable, if not getting more reliable than charts. However, we're talking about risk mitigation. There's so many examples of electronic charts getting wrong. Like I said, I think less now than it was maybe in the last 20 years. If you have a power failure, do you know how to navigate without an electronic chart, for example? And it's just always good practice to do that. So I would say even today, electronic navigation is fantastic. It's reliable. I would argue that probably in the history of navigation, it's still a novel technology. And if you look at it from a risk management point of view, do not rely 100% on electronic navigation. Have charts on board, have compasses, know how to use them, know how to take bearings, know how to work out where you are on the water, without the electronic navigation. So one thing I usually do is when I'm navigating, I have my navionics there, which is great. But every 15 to 20 minutes, I try to take bearings and work out where I am, and try to do it independently without being impacted by or influenced by the electronic navigation, for example. Good practice, hopefully makes me a better navigator, but it also stops me getting confused or relying too much or whatever. It's very easy actually on water to get disorientated. So to have techniques in place to make sure we know where we are really powerful. Developed or non-developed reflects whether the technology underlying the risk control measure is developed both in its technical effectiveness and its basic cost. Non-developed is either where the technology is not developed, but it can be reasonably expected to develop, or its basic costs can be expected to reduce in a given timescale. So here I would probably put AI overlays on your radar or your plotter or night vision sort of things. I would call that non-developed at the moment. The last time I looked, which was earlier this year, I was at a yacht show in Barcelona. You're looking at something like $15,000 to $20,000 for an installation. Now that's going to come down, and at some point it's probably going to be integrated into the machinery we buy, obviously at the inflated maritime prices that we pay for our boats. But that would be an example of a non-developed technology. And a really stupid example, and I'm sorry for this, like a rocket pack. Imagine if somebody came out with a rocket pack where you could fly within a kilometer of shore. Clearly that's non-developed technology. And again, that goes on to the point I said about when we're talking about mitigating risk controls, we have to work out how reliable those risk controls are. So I don't know how reliable these AI systems are. I think they're pretty useful, But again, we just have to be careful that the electronic interface is a true reflection of the analog real world. And look, AI is non-deterministic by nature, which means it can come up with different results for exactly the same scenario. And maybe that's something we can look at. So again, some of this is training. We should never rely on any one. We're talking navigation here, really any one thing, but we get a whole bunch of information together. Because we're the intelligence, they're the artificial intelligence. And if something goes wrong, we're the guy sent to jail, not the machine. Right. And then you got cost effectiveness. And, this is probably talking more about ship operations. So if you're running a large commercial organization, you have to make money. You have the profit imperative. Like I said, I've worked in medical device design, and there's always this cost-effective thing to make sure that something is safe enough. And if the cost exceeds the safety benefit, there's always a judgment to make there. But we've come up with the one example today where we've come up with a life raft. If you're doing a major crossing, ocean crossing or North Sea or going up to Iceland or something, where you can be expected to be out of sight of land for a period of time, do you feel confident trusting that one life raft, right? And for an extra $1,000, maybe you could get a second one. Do you have one EPIRB on board or two? Do you have a personal EPIRB on all the life jackets? And if so, do you have maybe a spare one in case one breaks while you're underway? So there's all this sort of cost effectiveness in terms of the owner's cost that we have to think about. And again, realistic, because look, I'm not going to say in the past I've been the most safe boater. I've taken risks. I think, calculated risk, don't get me wrong. I'm not stupid by any stretch, but looking back with a slightly maturer age, I wouldn't be doing some of the things I did back in my 20s and 30s. So yeah, when we're talking about us, it's very, very different if we have crew on board. So a solo sailor, if they're not going to endanger other people or rescuers, whatever, fine, do your risk. That's part of the excitement. But if we have crew on board, children, people who don't know how to sail, they're out there for a good time, then we really have to consider that as well, because it's no longer about us. So yeah, cost effectiveness of safety. And if you wanted more time and money, you wouldn't buy a boat. We all know that, but there is a reason we buy boats. And coming down here, environmental risk. I'm not really going to talk about this too much. I would probably argue that private boats individually are not going to be major polluters from exhaust or oil or toilet waste, especially at sea. Obviously, collectively, especially in lakes or static water, it's pretty bad. If you're in Holland or Europe, where you really get a lot of flow through the rivers, it just washes out to sea. I know some people may have a different view of that. But I'm not going to talk about that too much. If you sink and all your diesel goes in the water, that's one thing, but that's really a consequence of the risk controls not working. And I think if we're in a sinking situation, we got a lot we need to deal with, assuming we survive, and it's just one of the things we'll have to deal with. So, apart from sinking, we just have to make sure that we can't automatically pump all the diesel out over the side, for example, that we're responsible with our waste in our bilge pumps, our toilet in our bilge, toilet waste, etc. Right, report, whatever. So I think, look, there's a lot we've discussed tonight, and we've got 3 people watching, so it's really wonderful to have you here. Thank you. Please feel free to give me your honest feedback. I'm kicking this off. If you find I did something well, let me know. If you find I do something annoying, let me know. I want to learn. Like I said, this will only work if we have active, involved group of people looking to grow it to at least 100 people and start driving really interesting discussions about risk. Right. So I think on that point of view, we've gone on now. How long have we gone on? 46 minutes, I think. Is that right? So I think I'm going to wrap up. We'll try to keep it under an hour. Like I said again, thank you so much for everybody who joined. We had about 4 or 5 people on the on the stream today. For me, that's very humbling. So thank you very much. Like I said, hopefully we'll see you again. If you could subscribe, that'd be great. I got 1 subscriber last week, which was really wonderful. Give us a like if you can. That helps. You know how it works. If you haven't been on this side of the screen, it really helps. You don't understand. Feel free to reach out to me. Yacht Prep is my app and my website. You can contact me on the form. You can contact, you can drop a comment, but we'll wrap it up today. So thanks so much for that, and we'll see you probably tomorrow on the next stream. Good night.